Hello, friends, and welcome back to Dare Me to Prosper. This is episode 46. My name is Avery, and I'm your host, and we're talking about witch wounds. I thought this would be a fun episode to do the week of Halloween, but really it's so much more than just this idea of what we think of as a witch, obviously. And I think now is a really interesting time to talk about this because I think there is kind of a growing movement of women in particular who are really diving into this witch culture and referring to themselves as witches and, learning all about working with energy and herbs and quote unquote spells and things like that. And so it's just interesting to kind of see this reemergence. And so I want to look at kind of where the witch wound, so to speak, came from and the history of it and how that's evolved today and how so many women still feel this idea of a witch wound, which is not just about witches. The idea of a witch wound really refers to this idea that women feel like they do not have the space to be intuitive, to be sensual, to stand in their power, and that there can be a lot of shame around wanting to embody those things and wanting to be like the full feminine expression of themselves. And obviously the suppression of women has been going on for a very, very long time. And this is only one small piece of that puzzle, but it's all connected. So I want to talk about this in particular, how it affects you or how it can affect you and what being a witch really means. Because being a witch or the witch label was never really about what we think of it as today, like spells and cauldrons and big noses with a wart at the end. You know what I mean? Like that is all this kind of programming. Like this goes back so far where we've been programmed to see a witch as something that is evil, like Hocus Pocus or any witch in any of the Princess Disney movies. This has been going on for such a long time, right? The whole imagery of a witch, giving an apple to Snow White or whatever, like all of that imagery that we have been fed since we were children goes back so far to this original witch wound of painting the woman who had any kind of intuition or psychic ability as evil and dangerous. And obviously, like everything else, this was about control. And so the word witch itself really became a weapon, similar to like how conspiracy theorist, that term became a weapon that was used to silence people or to section people off and make them seem crazy or dangerous to society somehow. And so when we think of things like the witch trials, right, these Salem witch trials, the greater picture here was that they kind of treated these like a systematic purge, like they were trying to purge their community of these powerful women, because the patriarchal system that humanity has functioned out of has been this way for so long that anytime a woman demonstrated some sort of act of power or leadership or basically anything that threatened the male ego was immediately flagged because it triggered these men in leadership. And that still happens today. And so we're going to talk about it. And just for the record, this isn't a man-hating episode. It's just a very clear picture of the way that our systems have been built and how they need to change systematically. Because at its core, for so long, again, this has been like a systematic purge against the rising of the divine feminine, against women who threatened patriarchal or religious structures by living out of their intuition, by living freely. Because anyone who lives their life by their own intuition is someone that you cannot control because they're not looking for permission. They're not looking for validation. They're not looking to an outside person or system to tell them what is acceptable or not. And that reads as very dangerous to a system that needs to be in control 24/7. And obviously, we still see this so much today in our own government. So this is an old problem that we are still dealing with. But right now, I believe personally that we are living in a time where part of the reason that it's so chaotic and things are so crazy and it feels like all of our systems are really falling apart, right? Like our medical system is failing, our school system is failing, our financial system is failing. I think we are witnessing the breakdown and the crumbling of these systems, because that's the point where we are in history. Energetically, that's where we are. And historically, that's where we are. Like, we are no longer allowing this type of corrupt behavior. But Rome wasn't built in a day, and we can't dismantle this type of system overnight. It's messy, and it's going to take decades, if not hundreds of years, to really see the other side of this. But let's get back to like the witch history, right? Everybody knows about the Salem witch trials. That's the most infamous witch persecution that most people are aware of. It happened between the 15th and 18th centuries, especially like 1500s and 1600s. So to us now, this was a very archaic time. And as you likely know, it was also a time when church and state were pretty much the same thing. They were pretty much inseparable. Religion controlled the law. Religion controlled the social structures. Religion controlled everything. And so anything that threatened those religious beliefs and those religious rules were also seen as like illegal. They were a threat to the law as well. And I'll mention in a minute how this was really a global issue. But when we think of witch trials, that was really most common in Europe and early America. This was mostly a like white European thing. And that religious control is kind of coming from the Catholic Church, the early Christian church. And so anything that was outside of church-sanctioned power was seen as a threat to order. So women who lived, again, by their own intuition, they lived independently, they healed outside of church medicine. Interesting, we still see that today, right? If you heal outside of medical expectations, you're seen as dangerous. You're taking unnecessary risks. If you don't want to vaccinate your child, you are persecuted for unnecessary risks. And I would like to say, for the record, I'm not anti-vaccine and I'm not completely for vaccines either. I think it's a nuanced topic. I think there's issues on both sides. And in reality, we don't have an option that is fully safe either way, which is a huge part of the problem. And so I think that's a family by family, parent by parent decision. And I'm not getting into that, but I wanted to say that as an example of issues that we are still facing. So anyway, women who lived independently, who healed outside of church medicine, and who had knowledge of things like herbs and astrology and natural cycles, again, were seen as dangerous because they couldn't be controlled. They were doing things that were out of the norm. They were doing things that were not recommended by the system, by the approved laws and rules. So the Salem witch trials were in Massachusetts in early America, but that was really a continued pattern of what had already been happening in Europe for a very long time. Tens of thousands of women and even men were executed under accusations of witchcraft. And this happened Germany, Scotland, France, England, all during the previous century. So this wasn't just America, but those were the trials that are most well known. But this belief existed long before. And again, this was a global thing because of colonization. Like, this spread globally, this spread worldwide, because in many ancient cultures and religions and belief systems, they wouldn't have called it witchcraft, but this idea of people, or especially women, kind of being healers or herbalists or spiritual leaders of some sort, or women who had deep intuition or were psychic. These were very common in other areas of the world because these are just natural gifts that many people possess. But when Christian concepts were introduced to those parts of the world, the idea of the devil and evil started causing people to label spiritual leaders or healers as satanic witches. And so these systems in other parts of the world that used to be balanced, that used to be sacred, that used to be perfectly normal and fine, eventually colonization really distorted that and began to demonize what was originally like a very natural, ancestral part of their life. And even in areas that weren't as colonized, you still saw women being suppressed if they were like female shamans or priestesses or mystic healers and things like that. Because eventually these patriarchal systems started spreading, again, worldwide. And so in places like China and Japan and India, it wasn't necessarily witch trials like it was in Europe, but there were still targeted efforts to suppress female intuition, female leadership, female power. And this really started us down this dark road because before that, women who carried these deep lineages, like this had been going on for so long, passed from generation to generation to generation. You had these, again, healers or shamans or medicine men, medicine women, right? And that had been going on for so long until this patriarchal system started taking root everywhere, and especially when these Catholic and Christian cultures came into play. And even though many of these people who were part of these religions truly believed that they were, quote unquote, protecting society from evil, subconsciously it's fear, right? Why do people, talk about demons and Satan? It's because at the core, they fear those things. And so when they see things like tarot cards or energy healing or crystals or things that don't fit with their religion, they are fearful of it because they don't understand it and they've just been told it's something dangerous or something to fear or something that will somehow lead them down a dark path. And so they associate it with like things that are satanic or demonic and they fear it. And so they do what? They demonize it. They talk about it as if it is this evil thing that can't be trusted, that's a danger to society. It's the same thing that was happening so many centuries ago. And so during that time, especially the men and the religious authorities who were pretty much always men, they were leading these purges because they were operating out of fear that was masked as righteousness. Because women have always been very intuitive. Women especially have always had this very intuitive nature, and they often tune into that more easily than men do. They're quicker to trust their intuition more easily than men are. They're more likely to trust their intuition before men would. And this created a fear of the feminine. Because what they didn't understand, what the leaders, religious leaders, these men in charge didn't understand, they viewed as a threat. And again, the church's doctrine, both then and still now, equates obedience with holiness. You guys know, if you've heard any of my past episodes on religious trauma or deconstructing my Christianity, this is still a very real problem. The church stays in control in many people's lives because of this exact thing, obedience associated with holiness. And so when women stepped outside of that and they were finding connection with God, a direct connection with the divine through their own intuition or for ways that did not represent what the church believed, they became examples of what the church saw as disobedience. And so you can see how this all came together and created this long road of suppressing women's intuition for so long in such a way that we're still dealing with it. We are still dealing with all of these same issues where women are seen as not equal or as deserving of certain privileges as men, or that women are somehow not capable of the same level of leadership. It was easier to destroy women's wisdom and destroy their belief in their own intuition than to admit that they did not have the same level of intuition or that they did not have the same of connection with God, with the divine, because they themselves were not trusting their own intuition. And remember, not only does this get passed down from generation to generation in terms of beliefs, but also like energetically and ancestrally. And this is scientific. This is not just me being woo-woo, but your cells carry memory. The same reason that someone who never knew their parents could wind up with the same struggles, the same trauma, the same type of issues, that is the same reason why these type of witch wounds get passed down from generation to generation. And this tendency to suppress their own power is literally remembered by your cells. Mothers to daughters have passed down this feminine tendency to suppress intuition, to feel unsafe in their power, to succumb to men being in control. And again, I'm not a man hater, but I think what has happened in our culture today is that many men feel very threatened by the talk of patriarchy and the talk of our history because they feel like it's a threat to their own autonomy and power. And men are used to other men being the ones in charge, being the president, being the CEO. And women doing those jobs or doing them well feels like a personal threat. And so many men shy away from this topic. And I think it takes a very mature man to be able to look at our history and look at the patriarchal systems that are still set up today, that we still function out of, and recognize the problem. It takes a very self-secure, mature man to recognize and admit that, because it's still seen as a personal threat. It is still seen as the inability to control women. And again, during that time and for so many centuries, there was a really heavy focus on dualism. Like, there wasn't a lot of nuance. It was either of God or of the devil. So everything was either categorized as good or evil. And so when women displayed power or intuition or capabilities that weren't quote unquote granted to them by a priest or a king, it was seen as evil. It was seen as not good. It was seen as demonic, because in their eyes, it could only be good if it was given to them by a man in charge. But let's talk about what these witches actually were. Because again, witches is one of those terms where you automatically have these programmed understandings built in. And so you have this image in your mind, or this picture, this understanding in your mind that comes to mind when somebody says witch. But in reality, many of these women that were targeted as witches were herbalists and midwives and healers and energy workers and seers and psychics. They were keepers of knowledge, again, passed down through feminine lines long before these institutions decided that they were in control of spirituality and essentially built religions out of it. Have you guys ever seen Outlander? There's many shows that have this built into a similar storyline. In Outlander, how Claire comes back from the future where she was a doctor and a surgeon, and then she gets put back in the 1700s, right? And she takes that same knowledge and she becomes a healer, an herbalist. And in the show, you know, she's seen as such a threat, and she's often accused of being a witch, accused of using sorcery, when in reality, she was just using her capabilities that other people did not yet understand. And that's the perfect example of what's been going on for a really long time. And that still goes on today. Think about it. At that time, she was persecuted for things that other people did not understand because she had future knowledge. She had knowledge that they did not have. She understood things that they did not understand, and she was persecuted. So, and the same thing happens today, right? Women who are maybe very intuitive, or who are psychic, or do some type of spell work, which, by the way, spell work is just energy work. It's like manifesting. It's setting intentions, but you're using tools instead of just using your mind. I mean, that's all quote unquote spell work really is. But again, we've been programmed to hear these terms and think of it as something demonic, when all it is women, or men, but mostly women, using tools and embodying intuition and doing things that other people don't fully understand. And so they are shamed. You know, they're not persecuted in the same sense that they were back then, but they are dismissed, discredited, and blamed for practicing some sort of evil because of these exact same systems that have existed for so long. And today, just like back then, these women embody like a natural connection to the elements, to the moon, to the earth. They are in tune with energy that has always been a thing. Energy has always been a thing. Before Earth was created, energy has always been a thing. The power, quote unquote, of a witch is the exact same power that everybody else has. It's not dark, it's self-sourced power. It's self-sourced intuition. It is using the abilities and the gifts that each and every single human being is born with. It's just a matter of how much you use it, how much you tap into it, how you wield it. And nobody needs permission from a priest or a ruler to access spirit. That is a natural connection that each of us have. But that autonomy is still seen as dangerous in the eyes of a control-based system. That was true then, and it is true now. Even today, our autonomy, not just in this realm of like intuition and spirituality, but in any category, autonomy is seen as dangerous because you cannot be controlled. Everything literally goes back to that exact same idea. And by the way, if this resonates with you and you are someone who is in the process of tapping into your intuition, who is recognizing your natural abilities, who is starting to understand how energy works, how intuition works, that is you being guided towards becoming more powerful in your intuitive and psychic gifts. And if you've ever felt like a little bit uneasy, a little bit afraid, a little bit unsure of doing that, that is the witch wound that has been passed down coming out in you. So if you've ever felt unsure or a little bit uneasy about it, it's not because it's dangerous. It's because this has been happening for so long. It has been programmed into your cells, into your memory, into your mind as a child. And now we are undoing that. I have an entire course called Sensitive to Psychic that walks you through if you're just simply a sensitive person and you know nothing and you haven't really tapped into this, or anywhere you are on the spectrum, even if you're not brand new. I have a course that literally walks you step by step through healing your blocks and healing your mindset and your programming, and not just how to practice your gifts, but how to walk the entire journey from healing wounds and undoing blocks and shifting your energy and figuring out what gifts you most naturally have access to, and then how to develop them and what to practice and what that looks like, how to integrate it into your life. Because in my eyes, this should be a natural thing that every single human being just practices naturally. You don't need to call it spirituality. It should just be like seeing or breathing or touching or smelling. This is a natural gift that we all possess. We are born with this as a natural tool that we have as human beings to connect with the divine, to tap into our intuition, to help us live more fulfilling, more full lives that are guided in a way that is most aligned for us. You know, they say that life doesn't come with an instruction manual, but it kind of does. But the problem is your instruction manual is your intuition. And if you're not looking at it, then it's like having a map that you just never pull out and look at. So the link to that course is always linked below in the show notes. You can find it on my website. You can find it in any bio that I have. But I think it's important to make that connection that if you've ever felt unsure or just confused, that's part of this witch wound. You don't have to call yourself a witch to have a witch wound. It's really a spirituality wound. It's an intuition wound. It's a feminine wound that discourages women from accessing their innate power. And this also ties back to last week's episode about sexual life force and your sexual energy. It's just another thing that has been suppressed and programmed into you to think of as something that is shameful or bad or dangerous, especially for women. Men are not taught this in the same way. Men are not taught that their power is something to be afraid of. Men are not taught that sex is bad in the same way, unless it's like specifically purity culture within religion. This is very heavily, I'm not saying it doesn't apply to men at all, it certainly does, but this is very heavily a female issue. And the trauma of those eras lives in our energetic DNA, passed down through the maternal line, resurfacing as fear of being seen, speaking our truth, embracing our spiritual gifts. As women, we are often so self-conscious and we carry a lot more fear of being seen. And this is a huge part of that. Because again, what has been passed down are these DNA memories of being silenced, of being betrayed or being punished, being killed for wisdom. And so even if you had a great, however many great grandmothers that was persecuted in this way, you can carry that energetic DNA as a hesitation around visibility or around leadership or spiritual openness. And there's a very good chance that you came to Earth, that you came into this lifetime with an intention to break that narrative. And it comes from past life memories as well, where our souls experienced persecution for practicing magic or healing or non-traditional spirituality, something that wasn't religious. And that experience is still part of your soul's energy. And you very well might be seeking resolution for your soul in this lifetime. Okay, so let's talk about what the witch wound looks like today in modern times. And again, witch doesn't just have to mean people who call themselves witches. Witch can be a term that represents, in this instance, just anything that's spiritual, anything that's not the mainstream expectation. Modern quote-unquote witch hunts look like online shaming, online bullying, religious shame, being labeled as evil or demonic or crazy for speaking spiritual truth, for being intuitive. And think of this as well. Who, between women and men, who do you recognize as having more fear of standing out? Who has a fear of shining too brightly? Who has more fear of being misunderstood? Anyone can have these fears, but this is much more dominantly a female issue. And for the record, like a lot of these episodes, I'm using men and women as examples of the most obvious polarities here. But of course, there is a spectrum in the middle, and you might not fall into either polarity fully, and that's very valid. So I don't want to step over that, but I'm using these two polarities as the core examples, especially historically. But I just try to make sure you know that I'm not dismissing people who don't fall cleanly into either camp. Anyway, we recognize women as being the ones who have most of this fear. And we internalize this, right? Often as self-doubt, the part of us that still feels like if I am too seen, if I am too powerful, if I step out into the light, if I really step into my true gifts, into my true nature, something bad will happen. Or I'll be shamed, or I'll be bullied, or people will point fingers at me. Metaphorically, so many women struggle with this. And not even necessarily because of something that they've experienced in this direct lifetime, but because of those ancestral wounds and those past life wounds and those cultural wounds. But what I think is important to understand individually and as a society is that being a witch is not about cauldrons and casting spells. It's energy work. It's about living in alignment with spiritual laws, with your natural intuition. It's energy channeling. And yes, can there absolutely be people who use that for good and people who use that for evil? Yes, just like literally anything else. Energy is a tool that you have access to. How you use it is up to you. But the term witch was never originally an evil intention. So even when I do psychic readings, that is modern witch work. It's channeling, it's divination, it's energy healing. I would have been considered a witch. I would have been persecuted in the same way that all of these other women would be persecuted because I am practicing something that was disobedient and misunderstood by the powers that be at that time. By the way, I do offer psychic readings. They are linked below or on my website, and you can bring me questions or I can simply tap into spirit and your guides with whatever messages need to come through. But what I really tend to focus on, kind of my niche area, is really helping you receive information and understanding and clarity around your purpose in this lifetime. And I also answer questions all the time about relationships or loved ones or, upcoming changes in people's lives. But I'm almost always going to tune into something around your personal power because my own energy is so wired to that. And I truly believe that part of my purpose is helping other people find their power and step into their own divine purpose. So just a reminder that I do offer those. And if I had been alive during that time, I would absolutely be a persecuted witch, like many of you probably. Because today's witches are spiritual teachers, healers, mothers, artists, leaders, anyone who has reclaimed power, self-sufficiency, a connection to the divine, a connection to spirit, a connection to source, a connection to God without permission from someone else or without following some institution's rules for what that should or shouldn't look like. And so really this episode is about kind of reclaiming the word witch to undo and break down the past narrative of witch being something evil or bad or demonic or ill-intentioned at all. Many people, especially women who identify as witches today, are just using like ritual, spell work, intention setting. Again, that is all symbolism for energy work, using crystals, using herbs, using candles, using astrology. They're all tools. The tools themselves are not the power. They simply help focus the energy. They simply help as a conduit for the energy that already exists. A spell at its core is really just the practice of focused energy combined with your belief, which is literally what manifestation is. It's all the same thing under different titles, explained different ways. Spell work just tends to involve more tools that you're using as a conduit, that you're using to focus the energy. But it's the same principle as manifestation, the same principle as affirmations, the same principle as prayer. We are all so much more similar than we like to believe. So for Halloween this year, which ironically, I think I might dress up as a witch. For Halloween this year, I think it's a good reminder. I think as you look around and you see all the symbolism of witches and the imagery of being bad or evil or scary, I think it's just a good reminder of where this came from and how we can shift our perspective today so that this wound does not continue getting passed down to our own daughters and to generations ahead of us. Ooh, 3333 as I said that on my timer. Okay. All right, let's end this episode. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to leave a review if you're enjoying the episode. If you have listened to at least 2 of these episodes, you should leave a review. I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for being here. I appreciate you guys. Don't forget, everything is linked in the show notes if you are interested in checking any of that out. And I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye.